The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about data management, modeling, and management. And just as a reminder, you may or may not know when you registered, this is the first of a whole month of webinars around data, both for nonprofit and education customers. So if you're interested, do check those out and register for upcoming sessions as well. I do also want to call out that we do have the option, if you do need captioning, we have open captioning available, and we will share the link with you right now. So basically what will happen is when you get the recording, it will have the captioning included for you of this webinar. We had some people actually request it. So for those folks, they will already have received the information. But if you are interested, please do follow that link and let us know. All right, and with that, let's kick it off with a round of introductions. My name is Natalie Vainberg, and I'm a success content specialist focusing on education content. I've been with Salesforce for 4 years now, and prior to that, I was a higher ed customer myself at Cornell University. And joining me today is my colleague Matt Horton, and I will let him introduce himself.
Hey everyone, Matt Horton here. I'm a cloud success manager working in our higher ed space, so working with our university, colleges, and K-12 customers. I've been at Salesforce for 12 years, and prior to that, I was a student. So thanks to everyone for joining today.
Awesome, thank you, Matt. And if you have attended any of our previous webinars, you're probably familiar with this slide. This is our forward-looking statement. And basically what this is saying is just to make your purchasing decisions based on what is currently available. So if there's any roadmap questions that come up or anything like that, just know that we do ask you to make that decision based on what's currently available, not what's coming up, because we can never guarantee that roadmap timelines won't change. And onto some logistics. So we are recording this webinar, and the deck as well as the recording will be sent to you via email in the next day or two. So feel free to reference the links that are in this deck, as well as if you just want to review anything. And also, please post your questions in the GoToWebinar panel throughout the webinar. Matt is going to be monitoring our questions, and if there's something that's relevant to the entire group, we'll call it out at the end. And finally, we also have put together a trail mix for additional learning. And if you're not familiar with trail mixes, this is basically just a group of resources that help you dive deeper into some of the topics that we talked about today. All right, and with that, let's cover some of our agenda items. So we have a lot to talk about today. We are going to start by talking about data modeling basics. So some very basic concepts that you'll just need to know as you start using Salesforce. Just wanted to call out there, this is a fairly introductory webinar. So if you are, if you've been around for a long time, if you've been a Salesforce admin for a long time, this may be a little bit too basic for you. But we do just want to lay that groundwork and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So once we cover those basics, we'll talk about some data modeling considerations, so some best practices that apply to really everybody and even outside of Salesforce. In fact, we'll talk about some data import and export functionality that Salesforce has. And then we'll also talk about TDTM, table-driven trigger management. We'll talk about some basics and considerations as they relate to Salesforce integration. So this is particularly useful for somebody who's new to Salesforce and is just sort of integrating their other systems with Salesforce. And then, of course, we'll leave some time for Q&A for you. All right, and now we'll just do a really quick poll. And if you wouldn't mind just throwing your answer in the chat box. How familiar are you with data modeling? So just let us know if you're A, very familiar, B, just getting started, C, have kind of heard of it, have done some of it, but want to know more, or D, don't know anything, so just brand new to it. So yeah, just feel free to throw that in for us so we get a sense of who is on the line. And we'll give you just a few seconds. And Matt, if you wouldn't mind just letting me know what folks are saying, if there are responses.
Absolutely. Lots of B's and C's.
Okay, great. Good. Perfect. Okay, so you're kind of all in the same boat. That's the right level for this webinar. So that is great. Thank you guys for participating. All right, so let's dive into some of those basics. So first, just wanted to talk about what actually is a data model. So for those of you who have attended any webinar or accelerator or anything like that on EDA, Education Data Architecture, you might actually be familiar with data modeling in some way, because we do talk about data models in EDA quite a bit. But a data model, it sounds kind of complicated, but essentially it's just the way that your data elements are organized and how they relate to one another. So for example, here's a little snippet of the EDA data model. You can see that we have the account and contact objects, and they are related to each other. And you also have an affiliation that connects to the account and the contact object, and the relationship which connects to the contact object. So obviously, this is just only a little snippet. It's a short little portion, but this gives you an idea of what a data model looks like. So we're just organizing our data in these objects, right? And connecting them to one another. That's really what a data model is at its core. And now let's just talk really quickly about standard and custom objects, just because this is obviously the foundation of the Salesforce data model. So just as a reminder, an object is basically a data table where information is organized. So you can kind of think of it as an Excel spreadsheet. So if we were to glance under the hood of a contact object, it might be simplified to a table like this, just a list of contacts and some information pertaining to them. And if we were to choose a record, let's say we choose Ashley Strahan here and look at her record in Salesforce, this is what it would look like. It's just a gathering of information pertaining to Ashley that we can see here in this table. Okay, so now that we know what an object is, the concept of standard versus custom in Salesforce is quite simple. A standard object is one that is available in Salesforce by default. So some examples would be the account object, contact, lead, and opportunity. And a custom object, on the other hand, is created by you or your admin for a specific need. So the example here is an event object that may be used to track events. So basically, anytime you need a container for a certain kind of data within Salesforce that does not already exist, you would create a custom object. And just note that if you're looking in your org and you're looking at your object manager and you want to kind of get a quick glance of what's custom and what's standard, custom objects are always denoted with this little _C. So you'll be able to tell that those objects are custom. And we'll take a look at creating objects in a demo in just a little bit. But this just sort of lays the groundwork for you. So now let's talk about fields. So again, if we think of an object as a table, then a field would be a column on that table. So as we saw for Ashley, it had her city, it had her state, it had her GPA, etc. For a field, just like with objects, there are standard fields that come by default, and you can also create custom fields so that you can get exactly the information that you need and also use the terminology that is familiar to your users. Each object has a different set of standard fields. For example, the contact object might have fields like name, email, address. However, there are few fields that exist across all standard objects and custom objects. And here they are in our table. So first we have identity fields, and this is just a 15-character case-sensitive field that automatically generates for every record. So it's basically like an ID. So you might see something like this for an account ID. Then we have system fields, and these are read-only fields that give you some information about a record from the system, like when the record was created, when it was modified, and who it might have been modified by. So this is just a really important way to kind of keep track and audit what's going on in your org. And finally, we have the name field type. All records need names, so you can distinguish between them. And you can use text names or auto number names that automatically increment every time you create a record. So for example, a contact name might be something like Julie Bean, a name. But for a support case, you might have a different structure, and it might be CA1024. So these field types are present on every single object that you have, whether standard or custom. All right, now let's do a quick little demo of creating an object and a custom field. So I'm going to pop out here and navigate to my Salesforce org. Here I am in my demo org, and I'm going to navigate to the object manager. I started out in setup. So if you're not familiar with how to get to setup, you're just going to go to this little gear icon and choose setup, and it brings you to that page. And now that we're in the object manager, we can click create and custom object. Sorry, it always seems to take a little bit longer when on a webinar. Here we just have some basic fields to fill out. It's quite simple to create a new object. We could create that events object that we talked about. So let's say events, or rather I'll label it event, and then the plural, I'll say events. It does start with a vowel sound, so I'm going to add that. If we wanted to add a description here, we could. And for record name, so if this was the account object, it would be account name. For events, it would be events name. That's totally fine. And the data type would be text. And that makes sense. And then we can add some optional features. So we can allow this custom object for reporting. We can track activities and field history, allow it in chatter groups, etc. So those are just some optional features that you can toggle on or off as necessary. And we can also say that this is in development or deployed. So we're going to start with deployed status. If we wanted to keep working on this, maybe we needed to wait and confer with somebody to add a description or something like that, we could also put it in development. So it's not going to be available if it's in development. And we can also add it to allow it in search settings. And we can also add notes and attachments and launch a new custom tab wizard after saving this custom object. So we could create a tab for our for navigation purposes. So as you know, in Salesforce, you have those tabs at the top that allow you to navigate. You can make this part of that navigation tab. So that is really all you need to do to create an object. And we can go ahead and click save. And our custom object is created. And as I mentioned, we have this underscore C, so we know that this is a custom object. And now for each object, when you click into an object in Object Manager, you have this menu on the left-hand side. And the second option here is Fields and Relationships right under Details. So I'm going to click into that. And we see that we have these standard fields that we talked about, right? So we have the last modified by, created by, event's name. So those are, again, just across any custom or standard object. And if we wanted to create a new field, we would choose this new button. And it gives us the option of selecting what kind of field we want it to be. Right? So if we wanted to add a date field, for example, we have that here. But of course, there's quite a few different fields, right? We have number fields, email field, phone, pick list. So if you wanted to choose, for example, if you wanted to say what kind of field or what kind of event this was, you might have a pick list field with different values. You can have a text field, like we saw for the name, etc. So let's just say the date field. We want to add the date of the event. So we're going to go ahead and click next. And here we're going to enter our field label. So what is this field actually called? And we'll say event date. And that automatically populates the field name. And again, we can add a description here and some help text. So the help text might be, when is the event occurring? And then we have this option to choose, to check off this box to require this field. And we'll talk about required fields in just a little bit, but just obviously this is going to make it so that whenever somebody's entering a new record, they do have to populate this event date if this field is marked as required. You do not have to mark this field as required, but that is just an option that you have. So I'm going to leave it unchecked for now, and I'm going to go ahead and click next. And here you have the option to specify field level security. So which profiles actually have access to see or edit this field. And we can go through and look at all of these different profiles and check visible or read only. We're going to leave it as is for now, but of course you might be more particular with your specific profiles if the field is kind of more sensitive. I think I might have gone to previous instead of next. So we're going to go ahead and click next. And finally, we're going to decide which page layouts we're going to add this to. Since we created it for this new object that we just created, there's only one page layout at the moment. But if you wanted to customize your page layouts for different types of users, you would do that, and then you would specify which ones of these page layouts you wanted to add this field to. So in this case, we're just going to add it to our event layout page, and we're going to go ahead and click Save. And there we have it. Now we have our brand new custom object and our brand new custom field in that custom object. So it's quite simple to build these out. You just have to sort of think ahead of what you actually need in a specific object, and then you could bring in those fields. All right, so I'm going to hop back in here. Now let's talk about some data modeling considerations. So first and foremost, I want to call out naming conventions. Whenever you create records, you of course have to name them. And it's vital to have a clear naming convention in place because it makes it easier for your users to find records. And also if they're entering information, they have a standard way of doing so that makes sense. And it may seem pretty basic to talk about naming conventions, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't think about that ahead of time and then have a really messy database that they can barely sift through. So with that in mind, here are just a few things to keep in mind when creating your naming conventions. First, you want to stay consistent. So you want to, for example, you can see here for all of these campaigns in this picture, the naming convention starts with the fiscal year. Every single one of them has fiscal year 18. And so that makes it really easy to sort by what you need to find. So if you're looking for something that's in fiscal year 19, you're not going to even bother looking at these. You're going to scroll right past them. So it's just really important to have some kind of consistent convention that you stick to. It's also a good idea to keep it short. Usually 25 characters or less are ideal. And again, just, if this column is made smaller and you can't see the full title, it gets a little more confusing the longer the title is. So you want to make it really simple, really easy to find different records. You want to try to avoid special characters or spaces. Just keep it pretty standard, nothing too crazy. And use numbers if you want to organize sequentially, right? So if you wanted something to go on top, but it starts with like a Z or something, you might just add a 1 in front of it just to organize it that way. And finally, whenever you create any kind of convention, naming or otherwise, you want to document that. You want to make sure that when a new person comes along and comes into your org, they know exactly what that convention is because you've written it down and because everybody knows to refer to this documented information that you've set down about your Salesforce org. So always a really good idea to document. And kind of going along with that is help texts and descriptions. So Salesforce has a really useful feature that we saw when we were creating our fields. You can add help text and descriptions. And this is an extra step, but it is well worth it. In fact, when we talk to our veteran customers about best practices in their org, this is really the one that comes up over and over again. So using that help text ensures that your users know exactly what you're asking them to enter into a specific field and how you want them to do it. So obviously you don't need an explanation for something simple like the email field, but when you have something like the preferred email field, which is included with EDA, then you might need to clarify what the difference is. So think of that whenever you create fields. Is there anything special that your users need to know about this piece of information? And then you also have the description field where you can include examples. So if you want everyone to enter in the full text for a state versus just the abbreviation, you might include that either in the help text or the description so that you're getting consistent results. And we saw also that checkbox for required fields. So basically what this is saying is that that field must have a value whenever a record is saved within Salesforce. And so you can see here, obviously, you've probably seen this in many forms that you've completed in your own life, but this little red asterisk means that this is a required field. And we do recommend that you use these sparingly, just because if you have a ton of them, it can be, first of all, just tedious to complete. You want to think about what actually is required. You don't want to just make everything required to sort of force people to enter information. So use it sparingly, and also because it does kind of, it can conflict when you're importing large batches of data, or when you're doing a lot of different things. It might really slow you down or throw errors where you wouldn't expect them. And fields can be required on multiple levels. So first, field level requirements. This is the most restrictive of requirements. And basically what it's saying is that it requires that field to be entered all the time, regardless of how the record is saved, whether that's through an integration, the API, mass upload, or through the user interface. So if you think about it, it's, when someone's entering information into a record, it's easy to see that something's required and that they have to enter it. But when you have a batch import of thousands of records, that might cause some problems if that field is not already there. You can also use field permission on a page layout. And what that means is that you're setting the requirements for that specific page. So users on that particular page do have to enter in that field value, but not on a different page layout, maybe. So you can actually make this required for some users in particular page layouts, but not others. And that's a good way to sort of, like, maybe a field is required for someone in recruitment and admissions, but not necessarily in student services. So just something to think about. And finally, validation rules. Like the field level setting, this will apply all the time, regardless of where the record is created or updated. And basically the validation rule, there's a lot of different kinds of validation rules, but you can say that, the record must have some kind of value, or you can get even more granular and say it has to have this kind of value, whether that's a range or a specific value that you're looking for. So I've linked to some common validation rules here if you wanted to peruse them. There are also trailhead modules on validation rules to get you familiar with them. But this is sort of like taking field permissions one step further and getting more specific in what you're looking for. All right, and now let's review data import and export functionality in Salesforce. So whenever you're importing data into Salesforce, or really anywhere, you'll want to follow this process. First, of course, you want to gather your data. So maybe you have to export it from another data source, or just collect it into a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet. From there, you want to review your data and clean it up. So this may include removing duplicates, deleting information that's no longer relevant, and fixing errors like spelling or extra spaces. From there, you'll want to think about how the information you're bringing in will map to Salesforce. Do your various columns align with existing Salesforce fields? And that leads you to the next and final step, which is making those necessary configurations. So if you have a column that does not exist as a field in Salesforce, you'll want to create that field. Or alternately, maybe you want to, you have a drop-down field that already exists, but you need to add additional values. So that's something that you'll have to go in and add. If you follow these steps, your data import process will be much easier and smoother. And now on to import tools. Salesforce has a couple of options for you. First, we have the data import wizard. This is accessible from the setup menu in Salesforce, and it basically walks you through the process pretty clearly. So a few things to remember about the import wizard: it can load up to 50,000 records. So if you are planning to do a big data load, this would probably not be the right tool for you. It also imports data from only some standard objects, not all of them. So it'll take care of the most commonly used ones like contacts and leads and accounts, but it does cover all custom objects. So that's just something to consider when you're deciding what to use. And finally, unfortunately, it can't be automated. So that means that you will manually go in and load your data. And And then we also have the data export wizard. So similar to the data import wizard, it's accessible right through Salesforce. You can either export data manually every 7 or 29 days, or you can automate it to do so. And again, still on that schedule of 7 or 29 days, so pretty much weekly or monthly. And when you export, you will get a CSV file emailed to you. And note that if you're exporting a lot of information, you might just get multiple files. And finally, we have our data loader. This is a tool that you have to download from the App Exchange, but it is very powerful. It can upload, export, or insert data into specific records. It also has a much greater capacity than the data import wizard because it can upload up to 5 million records, and it supports all objects. So it just has that flexibility. Again, if you're importing lots of data or if you want to automate different things, this is probably the better tool to use. It can also be automated to pull or export data at a certain cadence. It doesn't have to stick to that 7 or 29 day schedule. So again, if you want more control over that data import or data export, this is maybe the better option for you. All right, and now again, let's do a quick demo and just take a look at some of these import and export tools that we have in Salesforce. So I'm going to go back to my homepage here. I'm going to type in data import. And here I have my data import wizard. Okay, so here we are. So it claims to import your data in 3 easy steps. So if we launch the wizard, first we're going to select the object that we're importing to. So you'll see here we have the standard object tab and the custom object tab. And we'll just choose accounts and contacts for now. And as you can see, it's quite limited. There's just these 4 standard objects that we're choosing from. Then we can say if we're adding new records, updating existing records, or adding new and updating existing records. So I'm going to choose this just because it gives me the most flexibility. And we have some choices to make here. So we can match contact by name, right? So if a record already exists, we want it to be updated, and we want to look at the name. We could also choose Salesforce ID or email or external ID if you're talking to a different system. But we're just going to leave it to name. And we also have other options here. So if there are specific fields that we have to look at, like for example, we want to have a primary contact for the account, we can specify that if we want to use the contact name, ID, or Salesforce ID or external ID. And there's quite a few here just because of this is a demo org and there's some sort of pre-rules and different things set up here, but you may not have all of this, or you may, but you may know exactly what you need. So I'm not going to go ahead and specify all of these. I'm just going to leave it at match contact by name. And then we can see where is your data located. So we're going to actually upload a CSV. And I'm going to just grab it from my computer and throw it in here. So this is just a sample data set. And I'm going to go ahead and click next. And then we're going to actually map our field. So as we mentioned, we have to make sure that whatever you have in your document, you also have in Salesforce as fields. So for example, we have this city column in our CSV document, but it is unmapped. Like Salesforce didn't recognize it when this import was happening. So we can just map it. We can click on this map button. And we can select the field that we want this to align with. So here we have our account billing city, and we can actually add multiple fields, right? So if we want this applied to multiple fields, we can just choose them. So we can choose account shipping city as well. And then we can click map, and there we have it. And we can go ahead and click next. And of course you would do that. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and change that to a single field. It looks like it's not working out for us there. So we're gonna go ahead and map it. And you would have to go through and do it for any fields that are marked as unmapped. So again, just thinking through how you name those different headers in your CSV document. So if you know that in Salesforce you have account billing city, maybe that's how you want to title your column there. So let's go ahead and click next. Yeah. Sorry about that. For some reason, something's not mapping with the name, even though it looks like it's mapped. Let's just try again. Okay, so apologies. For some reason, it's saying that the name is not mapped, even though it is. I'm gonna just go ahead and click and change it. Maybe I'm just gonna say name. Let's see if there's a name field. Okay, I'm just gonna choose contact name and map that, and hopefully that works. Okay, it is not working. Apologies for that. In any case, the idea here, you can see basically you just want to make sure that whatever your fields are named in Salesforce, they're mapped accordingly to your in your CSV doc that you are uploading, and then that should work. And once you have mapped all of these fields and click next, it will start the import. So apologies that that did not work, but hopefully this still presented the process to you well enough. And just to show you the data export there as well. So with this, it looks a little bit different. You can choose to export now or schedule export later. And if we click on schedule export later, this is the screenshot that we saw. So we can specify that, whether we want to include images, documents, and attachments. Let's say yes. Maybe we also want to say that we want to export this on a monthly basis, and we can say we want it on the first of every month. And we can say the preferred start time to be midnight. And just to note, you want to choose a time that's maybe not in the middle of your workday when a lot of things are happening, because that will slow down your org. And then you would choose where you want data exported. So whether that's the contact object, or you could choose multiple objects here, and you would go ahead and click save. And that export is scheduled, and you can see it's scheduled for the 1st of July at 12 a.m. All right, so with that, let's hop back in.
Natalie, actually, really quick, before you jump back into the presentation, this just came up in the chat, and I thought it would be good to call it the difference. If you could just show everyone where to download the data loader from. There was a mention of dataloader.io, which we want to make sure we call it the difference between the data loader and dataloader.io.
Sure, yeah. So what you want to do actually is you can just type in data loader in the setup in the quick find box and access it here. And it actually gives you the links to download it. So you don't need to go looking anywhere else. You can just search for it and download it either for Windows or for Mac, depending on your system. And then you will be able to access it right through your Salesforce org.
And that tool is included with your subscription.
Yep, exactly. So thanks for pointing that out, Matt. I appreciate it. Great question. All right, and with that, let's just talk a little bit about integration, because I know this is a hot topic for many of us, and it definitely aligns with importing and exporting data. So first, what is integration? So to put it simply, integration is the linking together of two or more different systems or software applications, physically and functionally. So integration has kind of two main prongs. One is technical, and this is the actual physical linking of systems and ensuring that data is syncing properly. And then we have the business integration side, which is process related. So for example, you might need to decide what type of data needs to sync and how frequently it syncs. So those non-technical but specific, business-specific considerations are also involved. And of course, that brings us to how do you actually integrate? So you do have a lot of options when it comes to linking systems to Salesforce. A lot has to go into this decision, including costs and return on investment. So hopefully this chart may be helpful in laying it all out for you. I won't go through everything on here just in the interest of time and because there's a lot of information, but when you get the slide deck tomorrow or the day after, you can definitely review this information. But I do just want to call out that the basic options are using a pre-built Salesforce connector, and this means that whatever system or app that you're trying to connect is already optimized for that integration, and all you have to do is kind of plug and play. And some examples of that would be Gmail or Outlook or something like Pardot. So they're built with connectors for Salesforce, or Salesforce has a connector for those tools specifically. And obviously, that's the easiest solution because there's no really technical work that's required there. However, when that's not an option, you may decide to build your own connector. And that involves using the Salesforce API. And this is probably the most technical option and would require a Salesforce developer to help. Alternately, you may use a middleware tool, and this is kind of like an outside connector. So it's not Gmail, it's not Salesforce, it's kind of an in-between tool that connects the two. And a good example of that is MuleSoft. It allows you to connect any app or system to Salesforce. And finally, you may do some combination of two or more of these, and that's kind of in this other options column. So that would be something custom that you can discuss with a customer success architect if you're working with one, or work out together with your team. So again, just take a look at this chart if this is of concern for you right now, and just take a look at these options and some of the information that's provided there. And now just quickly, I wanted to review the steps that you'll likely have to go through for a successful implementation, starting with understanding your system and data. So thinking about what is the data that's actually going to be shared, where is it coming from and where is it going, and what do you want to be your system of record? Is it Salesforce that's kind of like the voice of truth, that this is the most up-to-date information, or maybe it's another system that you're using? You'll also want to determine the frequency of updates, whether you want that update to happen in real time. So as updates happen in one system, they're automatically reflected in the other. Or do you want it to be a batch update? So that means that maybe once every day or once every couple of days or once every week, data is synced from one system to the other. You also want to identify system owners. So business units or third-party vendors, anybody that has some kind of stake in a system, because if there are errors or anything that you need to troubleshoot, you may have to gather all of those people together and figure out where the problem is happening and how to solve for it. From there, you'll also want to organize and prioritize. So thinking about which tools you're using, what are the costs for them, and what is the order of integration? What comes first? Which data gets loaded where first? So all of that is really important. And then the final step would be kind of to design and build that integration. And we talked about documenting a little while ago as well, but you want to document what your expectations are for deliverables, as well as any specifications, technical or business unit specifications for that integration. And you want to continuously be gathering feedback, again, from those stakeholders, from your business units, from your end users, to figure out whether this integration is working and whether it's what your users need and want. And I do also want to note that if this is something that you're dealing with right now, I highly encourage you to explore this excellent integration ebook that I've linked here, Build an Integration Strategy. It talks about all of these things that we just covered and more, and it kind of goes into everything in greater depth. So do check that out when you get the deck. And finally, let's touch briefly on TDTM, or table-driven trigger management, and how it may affect your integration or data imports. So you may or may not have heard of TDTM, and if you have heard of it, it may have sounded a little scary, especially if you're brand new to Salesforce. So since this is a webinar designed for beginners, we definitely won't go into great depth about TDTM, but I did want to call this out because you will eventually come in contact with it if you're using EDA. And also it is actually something that you have to think about, at least in the back of your mind, when you're importing data into your org. So what is TDTM? Well, it's basically just a set of code and Apex triggers that make things work behind the scenes. Specifically, this is an automation tool. A very simple example of TDTM working would be when you update a contact's address, there's a trigger that automatically updates the account address as well. So this basically just saves you some time. You don't have to go in and do it twice yourself. And there's quite a few of those things. And also just want to note that when you hear talk about Apex, all it is just another tool for automation. So you don't really have to know it as an admin because you'll likely be using declarative or non-coding automation tools, but you should just be aware that it exists and what it's for. So through this code and Apex, TDTM is able to disable pieces of code when necessary. So for example, when you don't want something to happen automatically as a result of another action you took. And you can also create custom triggers that plug right into this table and EDA. Again, this would be some kind of custom automation that you've decided should happen. And finally, TDTM controls the order in which things happen. And this is important to us today because the way in which you first import data into Salesforce actually does have to have a specific order so that TDTM can process it the way that it's meant to. And with that, let's take a look at what that order actually looks like. And note that even if you forget about TDTM from here on out and never come back to it, you should remember this order. So let's actually go through that. First, the first thing that you'll want to import is school accounts. And this will include any departments or colleges, academic programs, clubs, high schools that maybe you frequently recruit from, and businesses that you work with in terms of corporate relations or career recruiting. After that, you'll import curriculum information, such as terms, courses, course offerings, program plans, and plan requirements. And finally, you'll get the student information in there. So this would include the actual student contacts and their accounts, program enrollments, and course connections. And if you think about it, this order actually makes a lot of sense because everything builds on itself. So you need the school accounts to be in there first because terms and courses align with departments and academic programs, and of course, faculty. And then students are last because they're then associated with departments, clubs, high schools, and also with specific courses or course offerings. So it all sort of builds on itself. And again, this is just something that's really important to think about as you're first integrating with Salesforce and bringing in all of your information. So do refer to this order. And it's also included in the trail mix in the EDA documentation that you'll see, but just wanted to bring your attention to it here. All right, so that was a lot of information. Let's wrap it up with a few next steps. So 3 things that you can do today. So we talked about that trail mix a couple of times throughout the webinar. Again, this is just a collection of resources that you can use to delve a little bit deeper into the topics that we covered today. There's a lot of data management, data modeling, different trails that you can take a look at. But even outside of the trail mix, do explore Trailhead. It's a really great way to practice what you're hearing and learning and get some hands-on experience before diving into your own org. So I highly recommend that. From there, I also want to call out the Power of Us Hub. This is our virtual community, and it's a really powerful place. So you are all likely members of the Hub already, but if you're not, do join. And if you are, I would encourage you to use it as a resource periodically. There's a lot of really knowledgeable folks on there. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask, or if you'd like to run a situation or an example by somebody, everybody's really willing to hop in and help. And everybody's questions do get answered on there. Or you're directed to additional resources. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a data management series and that is running this entire month of June. So we do hope that you can attend the next webinar. The next education-related webinar will be the Healthy Org webinar that's happening in 2 weeks at the same time. So if you can, please join us there. And you can click on the link and register on this slide when you get the deck. And I also just wanted to call out the Higher Ed Summit that is happening on Tuesday, June 9th. This is a free virtual event for all, obviously especially focused on education customers or folks who are interested in the education space. So if you have not registered already, please consider doing so. The link is below here. And it's really great. It's free, as I said, and it is 4 hours on Tuesday, and you can choose what you attend and what you don't attend. But we're really excited to have Trevor Noah as our keynote speaker, and there's going to be some really great conversations happening around education. All right, and with that, Matt, do we have any questions that we'd like to field?
Yes, it helps when I unmute myself. Um, so lots of good questions coming in. Moses had lots of questions. We covered the one about the data loader. Can we touch on, I know we talked a lot about data architecture and items like that, but how that pertains to data storage, and how do I see what my data storage is? How do I see some of the limits, especially when it comes to integration as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Matt, do you by any chance have, just off the top of your head, do you know where that would be found in Salesforce? Um,
Yeah, actually, so if we could go into, if you go into setup, there is an area where you can see your storage limits in there. I think if you just type storage, I always like to use the quick find because clicking and trying to find things takes too much time. So I just type storage, and it happens to be storage usage. And this is where you will see object by object, as well as user by user, how much data that they're consuming. And these are your records inside Salesforce. And a simple rule of thumb, if you're in the beginning throes of your implementation of Salesforce, you need to bring some data in. If you have 10,000 records, multiply it by 2, and it's going to take up 20,000 kilobytes of data. And everyone should have approximately 10 gigs of data storage inside Salesforce.
awesome. Thanks, Matt. And that's a really great question.
Let me see here if we've got anything else. I don't think so. I think we were able to handle most of the questions in the chat here.
Awesome. Well, that's really great. Just so you guys know, as we keep talking about the Power of Us Hub, if you have any questions that come up when you're looking through the deck, or if something pops up when you're in your own org figuring things out, do please feel free to post that question in the hub. There's a data management group that you can check out. There's also a higher ed group as well. So do post there, and we do check it, and we can answer those questions there after the webinar as well. I do also want to call out that once we click out of this webinar, you will see a short survey pop up. It's just 4 questions, shouldn't take you more than just a couple of minutes. We really would appreciate it if you could take those few minutes to complete it. Your feedback really drives what we talk about and the content that we develop. So if there's something that you think would be more helpful, or if you'd like to see more of a particular topic, please let us know. We do take note of it, and we do listen to that feedback. So we really appreciate it. Thank you. And finally, just want to say, we know that these are really difficult times. There's a lot going on right now, a lot competing for your attention. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us here today to talk about data management, and we hope to see you on future webinars. And thank you so much to Matt for handling questions and for being our great moderator. Hope you have a great rest of your day.